On the evening of Tuesday, October 18th, 2011, in a weary industrial town on the Ohio border, a story was about to unfold. This was the kind of place where the skeletons of shuttered factories stood watch over cracked pavement and hollowed-out warehouses, and the people kept going simply because stopping wasn't an option. Nestled on Main Street between a pawn shop with boarded-up windows and a deli that had long since closed, was a small tattoo studio named Black Lantern. The shop itself wasn't much to look at. Its neon sign was prone to flickering, but the inside was a different world. It was clean, warm, and quiet, a space its owners had carefully crafted to feel like a refuge from the decay outside. Marco Dintes was the owner. At 32 years old, he lived a simple life by himself in a small apartment located above a bowling alley. People knew him as a quiet man, perhaps a bit obsessive, but in a way that commanded respect. His clients would say he could transform scar tissue into lifelike portraits and turn skin into a canvas for stories. His specialty was a gritty, grayscale realism, creating tattoos that had the haunting quality of old photographs faded by rain. Marco didn't say much, but his hands were steady and confident as he worked. His appointment book was filled for months, with some clients traveling from 2 or 3 states away just for his art. That particular night, he was putting the finishing touches on a tattoo for a walk-in client. The man was a local in his late 20s who wanted a memorial piece for his brother, who had been killed in a car accident the previous year. The design was straightforward yet deeply personal, a pair of angel wings protectively wrapped around a dog tag. For nearly 3 hours, Marco worked in silence. The two men hardly exchanged a word, the quiet broken only by the low hum of the tattoo needle, the occasional sound of a stool dragging across the linoleum floor, and the soft click of a portable heater turning on. At approximately 9:48 p.m., the client paid, signed the necessary release form, and walked out. The shop's security camera recorded him leaving, pausing to look back once before melting into the cold night. Naomi, the other artist at the shop, was in the front room wrapping up her paperwork for the day. She called out to Marco, asking if he needed anything before she headed home. He replied that he was just going to tidy up his station and then lock the doors. "I'll be out in a sec," he told her. Those would be the final words anyone would ever hear from him. The following morning, Naomi arrived early to prepare for a large, complex sleeve tattoo she had scheduled. She found the shop's door locked and the lights off, but she noticed Marco's car parked in its usual spot, just 2 spaces down from the entrance. Once inside, everything appeared to be just as she had left it. The front desk was organized, the art portfolios were stacked on the counter, and her own equipment was put away neatly. But Marco was nowhere to be found. At first, she reasoned that he must have worked late and simply walked home. However, when she stepped into the back room where he worked, a strange feeling of wrongness settled over her. His used gloves were still lying on the tray. A bottle of disinfectant had been left open. Beside his chair sat a crumpled paper towel, stained with black ink and a single, dried drop of blood. But the most unsettling discoveries were the things he would never leave behind. His phone was still plugged into the charger next to the stereo. His wallet was safe in a drawer, and his keys hung from their usual magnetic hook by the door. Naomi tried calling his phone once and then a second time, but both calls went directly to voicemail. She sent him a text message, "You okay? You forgot your phone again." There was no reply. By 11:30 a.m., her growing concern prompted her to call the police. When the officers arrived, they conducted a thorough search of the premises. They found no evidence of a forced entry, nothing was broken, and there were no signs of any kind of struggle. The surveillance footage was reviewed carefully. It clearly showed the client leaving, followed by Naomi a short time later. After that, the camera recorded nothing. Nobody came into the shop and nobody left, not through the front door and not through the alley door out back. It was as if Marco Dintes had simply vanished into thin air, somewhere between his workstation and the locked door. The video evidence was pristine, which some found suspicious. In the back hallway, the security camera had stopped recording for a 6-minute period. From 10:04 p.m. to 10:10 p.m., the official explanation was a glitch, as the building was old with deteriorating wires. However, the fact that a man disappeared within that specific time frame felt wrong. Detectives surveyed the surrounding area, but cameras on nearby streets hadn't recorded any unusual activity. There were no reports of suspicious individuals. No one saw anything out of the ordinary, and it was just a dark, peaceful town. By 10 p.m., most people had closed their windows for the night, and the only sounds were the wind and the infrequent noise of a passing train. They questioned Naomi, who was his final client, as well as other artists in the vicinity. Everyone shared the same story. Marco was a dedicated and precise person. He was always a bit reserved but never behaved strangely. He had no known enemies and wasn't involved in any drama. He avoided alcohol and parties, simply showing up to work, doing his job, and then heading home. He was the type of considerate person who would return his shopping cart to its proper place, even if it was raining. There was absolutely nothing to indicate he was escaping from a person or a situation, yet he was gone. By Thursday, flyers about his disappearance began to appear. By Saturday, the story was on the news, describing how a local tattoo artist had mysteriously vanished after working a late shift. People watching saw a blurry photo of Marco with his arms folded, his expression hidden under a knit hat. He appeared to be a solid, real person, not the kind who would just disappear. Searches were initiated, covering the woods, riverbanks, and rooftops nearby, but they found nothing. There were no clothes, no footprints, no traces of blood, and no noise complaints from the businesses next door. His apartment showed no indication of a struggle. There were a few dirty dishes in the sink, his boots were placed by the door, and a load of laundry was only partially folded. It wasn't just that he had vanished. It was as if he had never been there at all. By the end of the week, his phone showed 37 missed calls and 9 unread text messages. The very last message he received was from his mother at 11:12 p.m. on the night he went missing. It read, "I made lasagna. Come by this weekend." She never received a reply. By the time the detectives officially launched a missing person investigation for Marco Dintes, 48 hours had already passed. While this was a longer delay than is ideal, it wasn't considered unusual enough to trigger immediate alarms. Adults go missing frequently. Sometimes they choose to leave, and other times they are running away from something. It was standard procedure to wait. However, something about this particular case was already starting to unsettle them. There was no evidence of a break-in, nothing had been stolen, and nothing was damaged. His wallet was untouched, and his keys and phone were still in the spot where he had left them. His car, a silver 1998 Corolla with rust on its lower panels, was parked just 2 spots away from the tattoo shop's entrance, completely undisturbed. It hadn't been used or moved. The detectives began their investigation with the standard procedures, looking into his financial records, text messages, and work history. Marco's bank records revealed that his rent was paid on time, and his purchases consisted of groceries from a local Save-A-Lot and gas station transactions. There were no large or unusual expenses, no sudden cash withdrawals, and no suspicious purchases. His phone usage on the day he disappeared was normal. He had sent a text to his mother in the morning, ordered lunch through a delivery app, and exchanged a few short messages with a client to confirm an appointment. After 6:13 p.m., he made no outgoing calls. Then there was silence. They conducted a search of his apartment, which felt quiet and lived in. A calendar hanging on the refrigerator still had his upcoming appointments written in black marker. Dirty dishes were stacked neatly next to the sink, and a pile of laundry remained unfolded. His toothbrush was still damp, and his bed was not made. One particular item on his nightstand caught their attention next to a book on biomechanical design. There was a small, well-used notebook. Inside, its pages were filled with scribbled drawings, ideas for tattoos, mechanical sketches, song lyrics, a few phone numbers and personal notes. Nothing seemed threatening, but it was deeply personal, offering a look into a mind that seemed busy and focused, not chaotic or panicked. They interviewed Naomi first, and she was calm and willing to help. She mentioned that she had worked alongside Marco for almost 5 years, and they had a comfortable, quiet working relationship with no disagreements or tension. She portrayed him as a perfectionist, the kind of person who might spend 6 hours adjusting a needle to achieve the perfect setting. He was not the type of man who would simply walk out in the middle of his work without any explanation. She confirmed that he was not involved with drugs, had no enemies, and wasn't in a serious romantic relationship. His entire life revolved around the shop. His clients all said similar things. They described him as reliable and talented, though he often ran late because he was unwilling to rush his work. Most of them had never seen him anywhere but the shop. He was not active on social media and never shared details about his personal life. He had no known public arguments or conflicts. His name had never appeared in connection with local arguments or previous arrests. The detectives also found his ex-girlfriend, Julia. They had been in a relationship for 3 years, lived together for a short time, and had a friendly breakup about a year before he disappeared. She described him as a kind but distant person, not in a cold way, but he just wasn't very open with his feelings. She said he found it difficult to relax and felt that everything needed to have a purpose. When he wasn't tattooing, he was busy researching pigments, machines, and the technical aspects of needle depth. She hadn't talked to him in over a month but was very upset by the news. She insisted it was not like him. He might have been a bit adrift, but he would never just vanish. Then there was his workbench. It was the one area in the room that seemed frozen in time, as if an action had been suddenly interrupted. Marco had been in the process of building a new rotary tattoo machine with a custom, hand-filed frame made of polished brass. It was partially assembled, with its coils laid out next to a worn piece of cloth and 2 strips of sandpaper. This was the kind of detailed work he truly enjoyed, a personal project. The detectives took note of it, photographed everything, and collected the towel as evidence. The only fingerprints found were his own, and there was no DNA from anyone else. A couple of small machine screws had rolled underneath the bench. This small detail bothered one of the officers. Marco would not have left those there. He was known for always cleaning up and organizing his workspace. He had a specific, methodical way of working, so it seemed out of character for him to leave something incomplete. They investigated the alley located behind the shop, which was a narrow, dimly lit path leading to a locked utility gate and an old service staircase. There were no cameras in the alley and no indications of a forced entry. They found no blood or any dropped objects. They also checked the garbage cans and looked under the storm drain covers, but they discovered nothing. They spoke with the local businesses again. The pawn shop, located 2 doors away, had been closed that night. The pizza place across the street had turned off its ovens by 9 p.m., so no employees were there late. No one reported hearing any yelling or any unusual noises at all. The more they investigated, the more they realized how stable Marco's life appeared. He wasn't known for being unpredictable or facing any major problems. He didn't seem to be suicidal. All his bills were paid, his shop was successful, and he was fully booked with appointments through February. There was simply no logical reason for him to run away or abandon everything he had. Nevertheless, the reality was that he was gone. They widened their search area, checking hospitals, homeless shelters, and train stations. They also ran his photo through national databases but got no results. His parents, who lived 2 towns away, were questioned a second time. His mother, Angela, had spoken with him earlier that week and said he sounded tired but otherwise normal. She had been planning to bring him a casserole over the weekend. She described her son as a private and reserved person but also very dependable. She had not noticed any signs of paranoia, strange behavior, or sudden changes in his mood. The investigators' main theory began to change. If Marco hadn't left by his own choice, then someone else must have been responsible for his disappearance. But how could that have happened? There were no broken locks, no trails of blood, and no signs of a fight, neither at the shop in the alley nor in his apartment. He had not packed any clothes or taken his identification. Despite all this, he had somehow vanished completely within a 10-minute window between two normal work shifts in a quiet building with only one entrance and one exit. For the detectives, a particular question started to form in their minds. It was a thought they couldn't ignore, even though they had no proof yet. If nothing in Marco's life suggested he would run away, was it possible that someone else was already in the building when he stayed behind to close up for the night? After Marco vanished, a nervous silence fell over the town. This was not because a person was simply missing, but because the situation made no sense. This wasn't a large city like Chicago or Detroit. It was a quiet, old town with only 3 traffic lights and one high school. The residents all knew one another, or at least they thought they did. Marco was not just an unfamiliar name in the newspaper. He was a son, a friend, and an artist to the people who knew him. If he could disappear without a trace, it meant that anyone could. That frightening idea hung in the air on every street corner. During the first week, volunteers assembled near his shop. They attached flyers to telephone poles, and when the wind ripped them down, they put them up again. Marco's face looked out from the walls of gas stations, grocery stores, and laundromats. People started to arrive with flashlights and dogs, exploring the woods located behind the industrial park and checking the overgrown paths that ran alongside the riverbank. They sifted through dead leaves and smashed beer bottles, searching for any clue. Their efforts turned up nothing. Online, a Facebook group was created by one of Marco's former clients. In just a few days, its membership grew to over 3,000 people. Members shared their theories, provided satellite images of the shop, and worked together to come up with new ideas. Some people reached out to podcasters, while others contacted regional news outlets. A candlelight vigil was organized in front of the shop on a Saturday evening. 74 people gathered in the cold, holding signs that read, "Bring Marco home." His mother stood with the crowd, clutching a photograph of her son from his high school graduation. She did not say a word. She just continued to stare at the front door of the building, perhaps hoping he might simply walk out and explain everything. However, as time went on, the foundation of that hope began to weaken. With no physical evidence and no leads to follow, people started filling the silence with their own assumptions. Various theories began to spread. Some people whispered that Marco had gotten himself into trouble involving gambling, drugs, or something similarly dark. But there was no proof, no arrests, and no behavior from him that would support such claims. Others thought he might have been placed in witness protection, suggesting he saw something he shouldn't have and was taken away by the government. Yet, there were no federal agents, no unmarked black vehicles, and no one ever came forward with a believable story. Then some came to believe he had taken his own life, doing so quietly and intentionally in a place far enough away that he would never be found. But no suicide note was ever discovered, and he had shown no signs of depression. His internet browser history contained nothing relevant. He had bought groceries 3 days before he disappeared, picked up his mail, and paid his water bill. No single lead ever proved to be solid. Detectives went back over his list of clients. They examined his appointments from the previous 6 months, checked the names against state databases, and marked anyone with a criminal history. A few had small offenses like a DUI or unpaid tickets, but nothing serious. One man had a past assault charge from 2003, but had a confirmed alibi for the night Marco disappeared. Another client had moved to a different state. A third was in jail at the time of the disappearance. One after another, each person was cleared of suspicion. The owner of the shop building permitted investigators to conduct a second search. This time, they concentrated more on the basement and the access points to the ceiling. They looked behind panels of insulation, opened the furnace access door, and even used scanners on parts of the drywall to check for any signs of being tampered with. They found no blood, no fibers, and no scent trail. Cadaver dogs, which were brought in on the fourth day of the search, did not detect anything. The case remained unsolved. About 10 days into the investigation, a woman from a nearby town made contact through the Facebook group. She identified herself as a medium and asserted that Marco had communicated with her in a dream. She claimed to have seen a brick wall and a wavering light, and she said he was frightened and not far away. Angela Dantes, Marco's mother, was desperate enough to hear her out. She met the woman at the tattoo shop. The woman stood silently in the back room for almost 20 minutes before saying quietly that Marco was near something made of metal. The police officers on the case did not include this information in their official report. Around the third week, the community's collective energy started to fade. The weather grew colder. Fewer flyers were being put up. Individuals who had previously organized group searches began to ignore messages. As it always does, life moved on, but not for everyone. Marco's parents did not give up. His father, Joe, started driving the same route every evening after dinner past the tattoo shop, through the alleyway, and along the river path. Back at home, Angela maintained a binder filled with every update, timeline, and printed comment from the Facebook group, all organized with highlighters and sticky notes. They put up a $5,000 reward, using money they could not afford to lose. They called the lead detective every week, even when there was no new information to share. People started to observe how eagerly the town seemed to want to forget. Some believed it was due to fear. Others thought it was just easier not to dwell on what might still be lurking. The shop remained closed. Naomi stopped accepting new clients and eventually left town. 6 weeks after Marco disappeared, a letter was delivered to the police station. It had no return address. Inside was a page torn from a spiral notebook with a message in shaky handwriting: "You're looking in the wrong places." He saw something he wasn't supposed to. There were no fingerprints or DNA on the letter. The envelope had been mailed from a public collection box 2 counties away. The detectives concluded it was likely a prank. They thought maybe someone was seeking attention or trying to become part of a story they had no connection to. But Marco's mother saw it differently. She made a copy of the note and taped it inside her binder, right next to a highlighted sentence from the official case log. That sentence stated, "No signs of forced entry, no sign of exit either." And as the calendar turned to December and snow started to pile up on the sidewalks in front of the vacant tattoo shop, that was the only thing anyone knew for sure. He had walked into that room, and somehow, he had never walked back out. After nearly 3 months of inactivity, the case was revived with renewed focus. This new development wasn't triggered by a surprise confession or a new witness coming forward. Instead, it was the result of a new forensics team being brought in to inspect the tattoo shop again, a request made by Marco's family who had refused to give up. His mother, Angela DeSantis, had persistently sent letters to the police department, the mayor's office, and the state until someone finally granted her wish. A fresh set of eyes would now examine the scene. They would be looking at the same walls and the same floor, hopping to find a clue that might have been overlooked during the initial investigation. By the time this new team showed up, the shop had been left untouched for months after Naomi had terminated her lease ahead of schedule. The windows were dark, and a layer of dust had settled on the front desk. Old flyers were still taped to the front door. The entire building seemed frozen in time, as if everything inside was waiting for someone to return and complete the story. The new forensic technician, a consultant who previously worked as a state crime scene analyst, moved methodically through the shop with her small crew. She went from the front to the back, inspecting each room, documenting details, taking measurements, and noting any changes. The front area of the shop appeared to be in its original state, with chairs, workstations, and clipboards all where they were supposed to be. The back hallway, however, immediately seemed off. The paint on the bottom section of the wall near the storage closet was noticeably newer than the surrounding area. It had a slightly higher gloss and was a shade too bright. This was only apparent when looking at it with a light held at an angle. An officer mentioned that Marco sometimes handled small repairs himself, like patching holes or touching up paint, but there were no official records of any work being done in that specific spot. The area was marked to be tested. The floor tiles in the back room were mostly clean, but one tile near the drain had a slight discoloration. A small, circular stain, which was barely noticeable, had been ignored during the first searches. The technician decided to take a sample anyway, following standard procedure just in case. The most significant discovery occurred when the team applied luminol. After the lights were turned off and the chemical spray settled on the surfaces, faint glows started to appear. There were small smears just under the new layer of paint in the hallway. It wasn't the spray of blood spatter or a large pool, but it was enough to indicate that something had been cleaned up. These traces ran along the lower 3 feet of the wall before stopping near a metal vent cover close to the floor. The smears were too faint to get a viable DNA sample, but their existence was documented. This part of the shop had never been tested before because it hadn't raised any flags, but now it could not be overlooked. The team then turned their attention to the vent. It was old, with rust forming around the screws. After they removed the cover, they found the inside was clean, except for a single reddish-brown smear on the inner edge of the duct. They photographed it, collected it with a swab, and sealed the sample in a bag to be sent for analysis. The ceiling directly above Marco's workstation was also inspected. One of the ceiling tiles was not sitting correctly in its frame. A corner of it was drooping slightly. This had been mentioned in the original report but was never investigated further. This time, the team removed the tile. Above it was a cramped crawl space, not big enough for a person to enter, but large enough to hide a small object. The technician used a handheld scope with a light to look inside, moving aside dust and insulation. She didn't find any bones or personal items, but one piece of evidence did stand out. A single, partially torn disposable glove was tucked next to a support beam. It was brittle and dry, appearing to be months or even years old, and it had not been recorded in any previous evidence logs. It was tagged and taken for testing. When the technician finished, she took a moment to reflect. Everything she had observed pointed to something significant having occurred there, yet the full picture remained elusive, like a puzzle that had been partially assembled and then knocked over. There were no complete fingerprints and no blood visible to the naked eye. There were only hints, smears, smudges, and inconsistencies. Back at the laboratory, the samples were cataloged and given a priority status, though not the highest. The state crime lab was overwhelmed with a surge of violent and urgent cases. Marco's situation, while suspicious, was still officially a missing person case, not a confirmed murder, as there was no body. The sample from the hallway smear was put in a queue for testing. 6 weeks later, the lab results finally arrived. The glove provided no useful information. There was no recoverable DNA, no skin cells, and no match found in the national database. The smear from the vent was determined to be too degraded to analyze, with the report stating the sample was compromised. The reaction from the luminol was consistent with the presence of blood proteins but was not definitive, and it did not contain any viable DNA. These findings were enough to heighten suspicion, but were insufficient to advance the investigation. The report was officially filed, and the case status remained unchanged. Detectives scheduled a meeting with the DeSantis family to go over the results. They chose their words carefully, using phrases like indicative of possible trauma and insufficient for formal charges, explaining that more evidence was needed. Angela sat silently through the entire meeting. She did not cry or interrupt, but simply stared at the photos of the faint glowing smears on the wall, as if they were the last trace of her son. She later confided in a friend that it felt as though Marco had left his fingerprints behind in a mist, visible for a fleeting moment before vanishing. For the investigators, this left a troubling new question: if someone had indeed harmed Marco DeSantis inside that shop, how had they managed to remove every trace of the act, leaving behind only a faint echo? In the spring of 2017, 5.5 years after Marco DeSantis went missing, a call to the police tip line briefly breathed new life into the investigation. The call came in on a Thursday afternoon from a man in his early 60s who identified himself only as Ray. He was residing at a halfway shelter in a county 2 over from the shop. He explained that he had been waiting to share his story, feeling that no one would have believed him before. He admitted he had no physical proof, no phone, and no video, but he had witnessed something he could never forget. He recalled that it was back in October of 2011, a detail he remembered because heavy rains that week had flooded the drainage ditch behind the abandoned overpass where he had been sleeping. To get by, he had started walking along the shoulder of Route 31 in the early mornings, trying to hitch a ride or collect bottles for money. He said that at about 6:30 in the morning, 2 days after Marco had reportedly disappeared, he saw a man walking barefoot on the eastbound side of the highway. The man was completely soaked, looking as if he had been outside in the rain all night. He wore no shoes or a coat, just jeans and a dark, long-sleeved shirt with his hair stuck to his face. Ray noted that the man didn't look like a homeless person. He appeared clean, like someone who didn't belong out there. He wasn't carrying anything but was walking slowly, as if in a daze. Ray called out to him from across the road, but the man didn't answer. He just glanced at Ray once with an empty, lost expression before continuing to walk toward the woods. When asked why he was calling after so much time had passed, Ray said it was because of a photograph. A friend at the shelter had been looking through old missing person cases on a computer at the library, and an image of Marco from a 2010 news article caught Ray's attention. That was him, he insisted. That was the man on the highway. The story was unusual but not entirely unbelievable. The timing matched the days following Marco's disappearance. The location, Route 31, was about 9 miles away from the tattoo shop, a distance Marco could have walked overnight. The route went through some wooded areas and commercial zones, but it wasn't completely isolated. Weather archives also confirmed that it had rained heavily and almost continuously from Monday through Thursday of that week. Detectives went to meet with Ray in person. While his memory of certain details was hazy, the main part of his story remained consistent. He was adamant that he had been sober at the time. He didn't know Marco and had never heard of Black Lantern Inc., but he was certain about what he had seen. The investigators tried to find traffic camera footage from that section of Route 31, but the cameras only covered major intersections and none were aimed at the shoulder where Ray said he saw the man. Security camera data from local businesses had been deleted long ago, and nearby gas stations had changed owners, making their records impossible to retrieve. No other missing person reports from that area matched the man Ray described, and there were no records of discovered bodies or 911 calls about a barefoot man in the rain. Despite the lack of corroborating evidence, a team was sent to search the area Ray had described. They walked the stretch of highway and checked the nearby woods, drainage pipes, and abandoned buildings. They found litter, a rusty fire pit, and the skeletal remains of a deer partially buried under leaves, but they found nothing human, no shoes and no personal belongings. Ray passed a polygraph test, but the results were not admissible in court, and his personal history complicated matters. He had been diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder and had a record of psychiatric hospitalizations and arrests for vagrancy. He had a history of seeing things, some of which were real and some that were not. Even so, there was a sincerity in Ray's story that the detectives found hard to dismiss. He did not seem to be seeking attention or trying to insert himself into the case. He simply wanted to know if what he had witnessed was important. Marco's parents were informed about the tip. Angela held on to it as a source of hope, but Joe was skeptical. He argued that Marco would not have just wandered off in a daze and would never have ignored someone calling out to him. He insisted his son was not the type to break down, even under extreme pressure. Angela, however, wasn't as certain. She remembered an old photograph of Marco sitting barefoot on their back porch one summer, deep in thought. She said he used to walk around outside like that when he couldn't sleep because he disliked the feeling of shoes when his mind was racing. Ultimately, no physical evidence emerged to support Ray's account, and no other witnesses came forward. The case once again stalled in a frustrating state of being possible but unprovable. The story made its way to online forums, where Reddit threads were filled with different theories. Some users fully believed Ray, suggesting that Marco might have had a psychotic break or had been drugged or injured. Others believed it was a case of mistaken identity, and that Ray had seen another transient, a runaway, or perhaps the ghost of someone else entirely. However, one specific detail that Ray had mentioned multiple times, even without being prompted, stuck with the lead detective. He said the man was holding a small black object in his hand, which he was squeezing repeatedly like a stress ball. He described it as looking not like trash but like a compact, heavy tool. When asked to draw it, Ray sketched an object that bore a striking resemblance to a tattoo machine, a simplified drawing but clear enough. There was no way to verify this detail, but it opened up a new possibility, however small. Once again, investigators were left with a haunting question that would shape the next phase of the case. If Marco was truly seen alive 2 days after he vanished, where had he been during the time in between? By 2019, the once lively tattoo shop on Delaney Street had long since lost its former energy. The storefront was still there, but its sign was faded and cracked after years of exposure to the weather. After Marco's disappearance, Black Lantern Inc. had struggled to stay in business for a while. His old coworker tried to keep things running, even hiring new artists, but the dark cloud of that night hung over the establishment. Clients gradually stopped making appointments as word-of-mouth recommendations turned into hushed rumors. Some claimed the shop was cursed, while others simply felt uncomfortable sitting in a chair where a man had vanished. Eventually, the shop closed its doors permanently. The building remained empty for more than a year, accumulating dust and graffiti, until it was purchased at an auction by a small property development company. Their intention was straightforward: to renovate the space for retail use, possibly leasing it to a vape shop or a small boutique, something with low operational costs and a quick turnover. That spring, the first demolition crew arrived to begin their work. They started tearing out the old counters, pulling up the carpets, and stripping the walls. On the second day of work, a contractor was prying off a rotted piece of drywall near the back room, in the area closest to where Marco's workstation had been, when he stopped. As the panel came loose, he noticed something strange: a section of gray paint that didn't match the color of the rest of the wall. Underneath it, he could faintly make out something that had been carved into the plaster. They were words etched by hand. The carvings were not deep, but they were clearly intentional. The contractor brushed away the dust and leaned closer to read the message: "It's not safe. I saw what I wasn't supposed to." The crew immediately stopped their work, and the foreman called the police. Within hours, crime scene technicians were back inside the building for the first time in nearly 8 years. They took photographs of the message from every possible angle, examined it with special lighting, and checked for any hidden fingerprints. The etching was old, but there was no way to determine its exact age. There was no name or initials, just those 10 words pressed firmly into the plaster in a spot where a mirror used to hang. They sent the entire panel to the state lab, holding out hope that something, skin cells, sweat, any trace of DNA, might still be on it that could link the message to Marco or someone else. However, weeks turned into months, and the lab results came back inconclusive. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, only dust, paint, and silence. The investigators tried to figure out who might have worked in that specific room after Marco disappeared. The list of guest artists who had worked at Black Lantern Inc. between 2011 and 2014 was long and difficult to track. No detailed records had been kept. One of the artists had died from a drug overdose in 2016, and another had moved to a different state. The person who owned the shop at that time had a vague memory of who used which station, recalling only that Marco's had been left empty for several months after his disappearance, either out of respect or perhaps fear. They showed the message to Marco's parents, asking if the phrase had any significance to them. Joe did not recognize it. Angela, however, quietly remarked that the tone of the message sounded like something Marco might have written, saying it was similar to the cryptic, almost coded phrases he would use in his sketchbooks. But she could not say for sure. This discovery fueled a new wave of theories. Some speculated that Marco himself had left the message in the hours before he went missing, as a desperate warning or a cry for help. Others believed it was left later by someone who knew what had happened but was too afraid to come forward. The story caused a stir online, with Reddit users analyzing the handwriting and comparing it to samples from Marco's old notebooks, but the carvings were too rough and rushed to make a conclusive match. It could have been written by anyone. Still, the location of the message troubled the lead investigator. The fact that it had been deliberately hidden under a layer of mismatched paint and that it had gone unnoticed during previous forensic searches. If it was just a prank, it was a very elaborate one. And if it was genuine, it meant that someone out there knew more than they were revealing. For a brief period, the case felt active again. Officers re-interviewed old witnesses, called former employees, and reviewed the names of past clients, but all the leads quickly dried up. No one came forward, and no one recognized the phrase. Eventually, the shop was cleared for renovation once more. By the fall, the old walls and floor were gone. The message had been scraped away and replaced with new white tile and modern track lighting. A new business, a wellness studio offering cold-pressed juice and yoga classes with ambient music, moved in that winter. For the DeSantis family, however, the discovery had reopened wounds that had barely started to heal. Angela began calling the detective again, asking new questions and rereading old case notes. Joe, on the other hand, wanted nothing to do with it. He said that whatever had been scratched into that wall did not change the one thing they knew for certain: Marco was gone, and no one was confessing. But Angela felt differently. She believed that messages don't always appear when you expect them to. Sometimes, they surface when they are needed the most. And in the empty space between her grief and exhaustion, that simple sentence, 10 words carved into drywall, began to resonate more powerfully than any theory had before. Because if one person had seen something they weren't supposed to, the new, urgent question was who else might have seen it too. With the passage of time, stories tend to lose their sharpness. People continue with their lives, whether they intend to or not. During this slow process of fading memories, the case of Marco Dintes changed from an active criminal investigation to just another file in a forgotten records cabinet. In the years that followed the last significant development in the case, the message discovered behind the wall, life did not exactly go back to normal, but rather settled into a profound quiet. This type of silence does not appear suddenly. It gradually seeps in without notice, continuing until the voices that once demanded answers become still. The first person connected to the case to vanish was the tattoo shop's previous piercer, a man by the name of Cody Hensley. He had been an employee at Black Lantern, Inc. for a little less than 2 years, having started his job 6 months before Marco went missing. At that time, he was a young man, recently sober and attempting to rebuild his life. He consistently maintained that he had no knowledge of the events, stating he was at his girlfriend's apartment on the night in question. His alibi was confirmed, and the detectives never saw him as a person of interest. Nevertheless, he was a figure in the background of the story, a name associated with the events. Then, in 2021, he was discovered deceased in a motel room near Tucson due to a heroin and fentanyl overdose. There was no suicide note, and his body remained unclaimed for almost 2 weeks. Next to fade away was the psychic, a woman who had involved herself in the investigation from the beginning. She had claimed to have visions, peculiar dreams, and mysterious feelings related to water and glass. Back then, Marco's mother was desperate for any glimmer of hope, and the psychic's portrayal of a tunnel close to a creek was convincing enough for the police to search the location. The search yielded no results. Through the years, the woman gained a small following on the internet through paranormal forums and live reading sessions. However, around 2022, she erased all of her online profiles. Her phone was disconnected, and even her website's domain name was put up for sale. All efforts to get in touch with her were fruitless. She had simply disappeared from public life. Marco's former girlfriend, who was once the most intimate connection to his daily existence, eventually ceased responding to phone calls. She had relocated to another state, first to Pennsylvania and later to Oregon, where she started a new life with a different job and a new surname. She had cooperated with the police multiple times in the initial stages, providing a detailed statement and even participating in a recorded interview. But with each new attempt to contact her, she became increasingly withdrawn. In her final email to the police department, she stated that she had already shared all the information she possessed and firmly requested to be left alone. That was 5 years ago, and she never contacted them again. As the individuals connected to the case began to disappear, so did the sense of urgency surrounding it. The detective who had revived the investigation after finding the message behind the wall retired in 2023. The case was formally passed on to a younger officer, but this was more of a procedural formality. There were no fresh leads to follow, no active warrants, and no remaining persons of interest to interrogate. The boxes of evidence marked Dienties, M, were combined into a single folder and placed on a shelf in the far corner of the records room, under the inactive classification, a designation somewhere between forgotten and unresolved. Even Joe and Angela, who had once been the most vocal in their quest for the truth, started to withdraw. The media's calls became less frequent, and when journalists did reach out, the couple would politely refuse to comment. Joe had developed a deep resentment towards the press, the town, and the case itself. Angela continued her ritual of lighting a candle on Marco's birthday each year, but she no longer wished to discuss the matter. They seldom visited the old shop location. The property's new occupant had repainted the entire space and transformed the back rooms into a studio with mirrors and meditation mats. No trace of the past was left. It was not a matter of them ceasing to care. They had simply grown weary of endlessly reliving the day their son vanished. Every year, news organizations would revisit the story, asking the same predictable questions and airing the same inconclusive reports. A decade later, there was still no sign of Marco. The central question remained, where is Marco? Each time, the segment concluded in the same manner, showing his photograph, his birth date, and a silent appeal for someone to come forward with new information, but nobody ever did. The activity on the online forums also diminished. Reddit discussions were no longer updated, and YouTube videos exploring theories were pushed aside by the algorithm. Initially, people had been fixated on the most minor details: the location where Marco's keys were discovered, the unusual burn mark on the floor, the half-used tattoo machine. But eventually, public fascination shifted to more recent cases and newer puzzles. In certain respects, the silence was more agonizing than the initial chaos. During the chaotic period, there was at least a sense of progress, with phone calls, informational flyers, and updates from the police. But silence has a certain finality to it. It implies that there is nothing more to be said and nothing new to be discovered. The most difficult aspect was the complete absence of a body, a crime scene, or any confirmed sightings. There was only a man who went to his job one day and never returned home. For those who were closest to him, this void created its own form of lasting trauma. Every possible explanation, murder, suicide, or a deliberate disappearance, demanded an acceptance of something that could not be proven. Yet even within the quiet, something lingered. It was not quite hope, but more of a feeling of anticipation. It was a sense that the narrative was not complete, and that a single detail, a forgotten name, or an overlooked moment might still exist somewhere. And while the rest of the world had moved on from Marco Dintes, the truth had not. It was still out there, concealed beneath years of false information, faded recollections, and witnesses who were no longer alive to share what they knew. In the spring of 2025, the old building on Oak Ridge Avenue was slated for demolition. The yoga studio that had taken over the space after the tattoo parlor closed had quietly shut down the previous year, leaving the storefront empty and desolate. A regional coffee shop chain acquired the lease with intentions of completely tearing down the structure and building anew. The development drew little public notice. By that point, the location had become just another obscure address. The name Black Lantern, Inc. had not been mentioned in years. Construction teams began their work in April, taking the walls down to the bare wooden framework. They progressed quickly, first removing the flooring, then the ceiling panels, and finally the layers of drywall that were coated with many years of paint. But on their third day of work, as they took down the final interior wall near the back of the building, behind what was once the rear hallway, they discovered something that was not indicated on any of the building's plans. It was a shallow opening in the foundation, barely visible unless one was positioned at the exact spot where the wall had once connected with the old electrical panel. Behind this opening was a tight crawl space, no deeper than 4 feet. The construction workers assumed it had been sealed up during a previous renovation, perhaps many years ago. The air inside the space was heavy with the smell of dust and rodent waste. Pieces of shredded insulation clung to warped wooden supports, alongside a crushed soda can, a broken phone screen, and a collection of long-dead insects. At first, the space seemed entirely unremarkable. But then, one of the workers spotted some marks. Just a few inches from the floor on one of the interior support beams was a series of deep, irregular scratches carved straight into the wood. Close by, lodged into the beam at a downward slant, was a single rusted tattoo needle, embedded about halfway in, as if it had been stabbed or pushed with great force. The wood surrounding it was splintered and had a dark stain from long-term exposure. Yet the needle itself was still intact, a discovery that would ultimately change the course of the investigation. The workers did not immediately know what the object was, but the construction foreman, who had lived in the area his whole life, was familiar with the building's past. He placed a call to the police department. By that evening, the area had been secured as a crime scene. For the first time in almost 10 years, Marco Dintes' name was active in the police system again. Investigators came back to the site, this time equipped with tools designed for forensic evidence collection. They carefully documented every part of the crawl space. There were no human remains or blood evidence. However, the scratch marks near the embedded needle did not appear to be accidental. They were arranged in vertical, parallel lines, resembling tally marks or a frantic attempt to dig. There were no initials or any kind of written communication, only signs of deliberate and possibly panicked damage. The needle itself was not a standard model. It featured a unique design, with a half-wrap coil system and a specially notched base plate. This design was an exact match for a custom model Marco had been developing in the months leading up to his disappearance. This crucial detail made it clear whatever occurred behind that wall was not by chance. Crime scene technicians collected the needle and submitted it for forensic testing. The analysis found no fingerprints, no traces of DNA, and no biological evidence. The moisture and heat within the sealed crawl space had caused all such evidence to break down over time. But the needle's position, its angle, and the amount of force needed to drive it into the wood suggested it was more than just a dropped tool. Someone had intentionally forced it into the beam. The room it was hidden behind was once part of the rear hallway, not far from where the chemical agent luminol had revealed faint signs of what might have been blood. That evidence was never confirmed. It was the same section of wall where, years earlier, a reddish stain had been left untested because of a laboratory backlog, and where ceiling tiles had appeared to be out of place, a detail that led nowhere. All these points of interest were in the same line of sight. The crawl space was situated directly behind all of it, hidden for years by just a few inches of drywall. Detectives reopened the case file once more. They compared photographs from the initial investigation, examined Marco's design sketches, and verified that the needle's construction down to the soldering was identical to one of the few prototypes he had discussed with his colleagues. That particular design had never been mass-produced. He was still perfecting it the week he went missing. But apart from the needle, there was nothing else to be found. No tools, no journal, and no articles of clothing. The scratches could not be dated, and the crawl space had no other exit or ventilation. It was not clear how anyone could have gotten into it unless they were present during a renovation or had intimate knowledge of the building's structure. Speculation erupted on the internet. Some were convinced that Marco had been concealed there for a short time or that he had left the needle as a signal. Others proposed that the needle could have been planted, although there was no proof that it had been disturbed in many years. A minority wondered if the needle was not left by Marco at all, but rather by someone attempting to erase any trace of him. But with no human remains, no surveillance footage, and no new suspects, the investigation's momentum started to wane once again. The coffee shop delayed its construction plans but did not cancel them entirely. Work on the site resumed a few weeks later. The support beam was taken out, cataloged, and put into evidence storage with the other items from the case. The walls were rebuilt with new drywall and new tile, and a new business name was placed on the front of the building. Still, the needle stood as a powerful symbol, a small piece of evidence proving that Marco had been in that building. It suggested that perhaps in his final moments, he had tried to communicate something, to leave some kind of mark. For the investigators, it was not a resolution, but it was the closest thing to a clue they had discovered in a long time. For his parents, it was something to cling to, a sign that Marco had not just vanished without a trace. It suggested that somewhere within those scratches in the wood grain was the echo of a struggle, a piece of the truth fighting to be revealed, something that someone had worked very hard to keep hidden. The discovery of the needle both changed the entire situation and changed nothing at all. As soon as a picture of it was shared online, theories began to spread like wildfire almost immediately. A rusted, half-embedded tattoo needle found behind a wall nearly a decade after a man disappeared from that exact location was the kind of detail perfectly suited for the internet. In a matter of days, the number of Reddit discussions grew. YouTube investigators put together detailed timelines, and TikTok creators shared diagrams of the crawl space with grainy images from the original case file overlaid on top. Everyone had their own theory, and none of them were the same. Some were convinced that Marco had been walled in while still alive, hidden inside the crawl space during a renovation, perhaps while sedated or possibly even conscious. The scratches on the beam, which looked like tally marks, were interpreted as a desperate effort to signal for help. The embedded needle became the central point of every theory. Its angle, its depth, and the gouges in the wood around it were all examined as if they could disclose the motive, the time of death, or even the identity of the person responsible. Others believed that Marco might have gone into hiding on his own, using the space as a brief refuge from a person or a situation. However, this idea did not explain the complete silence that followed. There were no reported sightings, no financial transactions, and no indication that he had lived long enough to leave. In online groups, building plans were meticulously analyzed. Floor plans from every stage of the property's history, as a tattoo parlor, a yoga studio, and a vacant space, were uploaded and commented on. The crawl space did not appear on any of these plans, which only deepened the mystery. Was it deliberately concealed, or had it simply been missed for all these years? Former colleagues and past clients were located and contacted. Some refused to talk, while others consented to anonymous interviews for long-form podcasts. One of them, a former apprentice named Tori, shared a strange detail. She said that Marco had become increasingly paranoid in his final months. He would often make remarks about someone lingering around the shop after closing time or about an unfamiliar car parked across the street. He never mentioned any names, only gave vague hints about someone from his past who may or may not have been a client. He had also started to lock the drawers at his workstation, even while he was on shift, which was something he had never done before. At the time, they attributed his behavior to stress, but looking back, it seemed much more significant. Podcasts offered a wide range of theories. One episode suggested that Marco might have discovered an illegal activity happening in or near the shop, such as trafficking, forgery, or even organized crime, but there was never any evidence to back this up. Another podcast mentioned that the psychic from the early days of the case had spoken of a choking darkness behind wood, a cryptic statement that now appeared strangely prophetic. That psychic, however, had not been seen or heard from in years. The crawl space itself, which was the focus of every theory, provided very little for the investigators to work with. The forensic team conducted numerous scans but found no blood, no fibers, no personal items, and not even a single fingerprint. Whatever had taken place in that space had left no evidence that modern science could analyze. The wood only showed signs of age and decay. And while the needle was confirmed to be Marco's custom design, there was no way to know when it had been placed there. The police re-examined all the evidence, and after several weeks of internal meetings, they declared the discovery inconclusive, a finding that left everyone unsatisfied. For Marco's family, this development brought back pain that had only just begun to heal. They chose not to make any public statements. Their lawyer released a short announcement asking for privacy and patience, reminding everyone that speculation was not the same as justice. But their silence only fueled more theories. Some online commentators argued that the needle was planted to attract attention. Others believed it was a message for help from the afterlife. A few even claimed that it was not Marco's needle at all, that it had been wrongly identified, or that the entire discovery was a hoax meant to breathe new life into a cold case. The most radical corners of the internet proposed conspiracy theories that Marco had never even existed, and that the whole case was an elaborate media stunt. But for the people who had truly known him, the needle was a deeply personal discovery. His ex-girlfriend posted a single picture on a social media account that is now deleted. It was an old photograph of Marco drawing that same coil design in a notebook, dated 4 months before he disappeared. The post had no caption, only the image. It was all that was needed. Then the tips started coming in. A few users on anonymous forums claimed to have seen Marco. One person said he was in Albuquerque, while another was certain they saw him in Oregon. Each tip was vague, impossible to verify, and ultimately discarded. But one piece of information was particularly striking. A user on a now-defunct forum shared a blurry picture of a wall with cracked and peeling paint, showing a scratch pattern that was nearly identical. It featured long, vertical lines carved into the wood. The photo was traced back to a condemned building in a nearby state, hundreds of miles away from the original tattoo shop. Investigators looked into it, but the building had already been torn down, leaving nothing behind. Still, the similarity was remarkable, featuring the same 5 marks in the same arrangement. This led to a fresh wave of speculation. Was Marco trying to leave clues? Had he managed to escape and was attempting to communicate something? Or was someone deliberately creating copies to cause confusion? Nobody knew for sure. The photo could not be verified and the user who posted it vanished. It was another dead end. But one question continued to emerge, louder than all the others. If Marco was the one who placed that needle and made those scratches, then how did he get inside that crawl space? And even more critically, how did he get out? It took almost 11 years for the case of Marco Dintes to reach a podcast producer who was known for re-examining cold cases that felt like unresolved emotional wounds. The podcast series had earned a reputation for its careful and factual approach, staying away from overly dramatic storytelling and sensationalism. It focused strictly on facts, witness accounts, and official documents. In Marco's situation, such material was limited. But the case had something unique, a single, haunting detail that had never been explained. A rusted tattoo needle stuck in a wall that no one had looked behind for nearly a decade. The podcast episode was just under an hour long. It began with an overview of Marco's life, a recap of his disappearance, and the timeline that most people were already familiar with. But in the final part of the episode, the host read something that no one outside of Marco's family had ever heard. It was a handwritten letter from Marco's mother, which she had sent months earlier after the discovery inside the wall. The words in her letter were steady, and while her grief was evident, it was controlled. She wrote that Marco was an extremely precise person, and that everything he owned had a specific place. She recalled a time he took a full day off from work just to arrange his ink bottles by their specific shade of color. She was certain that the needle's placement in the wall was not an accident. It had been deliberately placed there, either by him or by another person. She believed that if Marco was the one who did it, his intention was for it to be discovered. The podcast had a powerful impact. The number of downloads soared, and people shared it widely on various social media platforms, tagging police departments, journalists, and amateur detectives. This renewed attention created a subtle but significant effect within the local police department, where the cold case unit had long since moved Marco's file to the back of a metal cabinet with the label inactive. Within a few weeks of the episode's release, 2 investigators were tasked with re-examining the needle. The goal was not to reopen the entire investigation, as there were not enough funds or staff for that, but simply to take another look in case something had been overlooked. They reviewed every photograph, every report, and every piece of forensic information related to the crawl space. The wooden beam had been tested for fingerprints and DNA, but nothing was found. The needle had been properly cataloged, photographed, and stored. There were no smudges or fibers on it, only signs of rust. It was confirmed to be Marco's design, a fact that remained undisputed. The etching on the coil was a match for drawings found in his notebook, but this information did not reveal who put it there, when it was placed, or for what reason. The scratch marks around the needle were more difficult to understand. Some thought they were a sign of panic. Others believed they were a countdown or a hidden message that only Marco would be able to decipher, a pattern of desperation slowly carved into the old wood. But without any context, the marks were just meaningless damage. And so, the investigation hit another dead end. The building itself had been completely transformed. The new coffee shop that had taken over the property had completed its renovations, sealing the crawl space during the construction process. The owners had allowed the wall to be temporarily opened for the investigation, but no new evidence was found, only the empty space where the beam had once been, which was now filled with new support structures. In the end, the police gave permission for the wall to be sealed up again, and that was the end of it. The coffee shop opened and enjoyed a steady flow of customers. Patrons came and went, drinking their cold-brewed coffee and browsing on their laptops just a few feet away from where Marco might have spent his last moments of consciousness. The staff had been given a brief explanation, told only that an old item had been found during the demolition. Most of them did not ask for more details. Those who did soon realized it was a story no one wanted to tell more than once. But for the people who had followed the case, the image of the needle remained. A custom-made needle, driven in so deeply that it could not have fallen, rusted into a permanent fixture. It had not broken or slipped. It had been intentionally placed, not thrown or dropped, but placed. The theories eventually faded, and the online discussion slowed down. The subreddit that had once been filled with constant updates and speculation became quiet. A final comment, pinned to the top of the page, offered a somber conclusion: some mysteries do not get resolved. They are simply abandoned over time. Marco's parents never released another public statement. His father had started to lose his eyesight, and his mother seldom left their home. They had stopped communicating with the media years before, worn out by the endless cycle of retelling their story and the silence that invariably followed. In her letter, she had included only one sentence that offered any semblance of closure. She wrote that if this was all they would ever find out, she hoped it was enough for him to be remembered. But even that sentiment felt incomplete. The reality is that the case never truly concluded. It was not officially closed, it just stopped progressing. There were no bodies found, no charges filed, and no confirmed crime. All that remained was a missing man, a message carved behind old paint, and a needle in a wall, like a whisper captured in time. And that is what continues to trouble people. It is not just that Marco disappeared or that the evidence led to nothing, but that something, a clue, a warning, a final act, was sitting right there in the wall for years, and nobody saw it. It was a message that might have been scratched by trembling hands or perhaps carefully carved with a specific purpose. Either way, it had remained hidden from view. Now, concealed behind new drywall and fresh plaster, that spot is just a part of the coffee shop's interior. Baristas stack boxes nearby and customers laugh, unaware of the history. There is no plaque, no marker, and no sign to indicate what was found, but the space itself remembers, even if no one else does.